and welcome back to Sovereign Sanity. This is video number 6. I'm going to call this a special edition because if you've been following along so far, you're probably aware that we have covered quite a bit of information regarding sovereignty, and I'm going to describe what we've covered so far as having had an opportunity to establish some integrity on the subject of sovereignty. And now we're at the point where I can start to share more perspective and what I would refer to as using your sovereign voice in real life or in court should you need to. So the way we're going to do that today as we move forward is I'm going to bring forward a series of questions and provide the answer. So question number 1 is, how can I claim this authority if I don't really know what it's all about? So as we dive into this first question, I would say that it appears to be that there are a couple of slightly different perspectives on this subject. So I would say that whatever you decide to explore, try to pay attention to it with maybe a long-term goal to actually learn it, because your brain knows the difference, you know, as compared to viewing something from a short-term perspective, something like a spectator, because there really is no easy answer here, no easy way to find this solution. It seems people are quite often looking for a fast answer, but what it really boils down to is at the end of the day, should you agree that this perspective does relate to you at the core of your being, it is likely that one day you may be asked to explain it and through your process of defending it. So as we move forward with trying to explain things, the main point here is you really should try to pay attention to it with the intention to learn it versus viewing it as a spectator. So if you're here for the right reasons and this is really capturing your attention, we're on the right track. So as we continue trying to explain the subject of sovereignty, we seem to keep getting back to, based on some feedback, this question of you. Who are you? And what is this authority that we're talking about that maybe some people have never heard of before? So when you start to ask the question, who are you, there appears to be a deeper question of what that relates to and what that authority is connected to. So based on the feedback, we seem to be having a little bit of confusion toward what's the difference of these expressions that I'm referring to. So what is a sovereign voice? What is a voice of God? What is an intrinsic natural being voice? Essentially, what I want to say is whether or not you relate to the idea of being a sovereign, which is, you know, there is a greater authority other than you that is undefinable, perhaps hard to explain, and if you believe that, you know, the voice of God is the authority that you acknowledge, or perhaps you don't acknowledge any authority and you just think that you're an intrinsic being and your voice is not subject to any other authority. So whatever mindset that you believe, you are your first individual authority. And when you're born, there's something called a live birth certificate that is produced. And the process that we're starting to refer to here about your person and the difference, that not being you, but something that's sort of attached to you at the time of birth. So what we're explaining here is what's happening is at the time of your birth, shortly after your live certificate is recorded, there's another certificate that surfaces at the time of your birth. You may have heard the expression of straw man in the past, and this is where the introduction of the person starts to come into play. The person becoming part of a collective authority, because you're an individual authority naturally, but how do you go from the individual to be considered as part of a collective? So there's another certificate that is created, and that's called a birth certificate. And that birth certificate is actually the birth of your corporation. I'm introducing the word corporation now, as many folks in this modern age are familiar with the idea of corporations and how they operate and their purposes. So what's happening here is essentially your natural being is being introduced to a corporate identity. So your person, so the person's given a first and a last name, and it's generally the stage or the platform to start making bargaining agreements between the two authorities. But essentially, when you sign any type of agreement under the capacity of your person or the collective authority, which is not you, it's just attached to you or something that you can use if or when you choose to, that is being negotiated under the platform of the collective authority. Now, this is just an option that individuals have. And it seems as though what's happened is when we're born, we weren't really told that this was happening. So people generally go about their life thinking this is the only way. But what's really happening here is this hasn't gone anywhere. Your individual authority is always in check, and it's always active. And if ever you want to call upon it, that's what we're talking about in this video series. This is the history of your individual authority. If your rights and freedoms and your sense of survival is being threatened, it's really important that you try to keep an open mind, to pay attention to this, because the history of authority is worthy of putting effort into. And if you agree, let's move forward. So as we dive in just a little bit deeper, this visual might help to simplify it even more. So here you are, you're born as the natural being. At the time of your birth, there's a live birth certificate that's recorded, and this is documenting the individual authority of the natural being. And technically, this natural being does not have a name, it does not need a name, it is a record of a live birth of a being. And then shortly after that, what happens is the birth certificate is created, and on that note, let me introduce the special guest to today's show, the straw man. Shortly after my natural birth, this lovely character showed up as an opportunity for me to consider bargaining at the collective authority table. This straw man was given a first and a last name. It's an opportunity for me to decide whether or not I would like to engage in contracts with the corporation of the collective authority. If I should ever choose to do so, I do not actually use my hand to sign documents. It was quite the experience when going to administrate for a passport so that I could enter a port and leave another port as part of a safety concern. When I went to the government agent and insisted that I use a stamp to administrate for the person, because the person is not me, and I would not want to sign a document or a contract stating that it is me, because it's just something that I'm administrating for to be what I describe as a team player. So the person is something that's created shortly after your birth as an opportunity to negotiate with the collective authority. Moving forward to the next question. If the person is not me, and it's merely something I can use if or when I choose to, why don't I know anyone else that's aware of this? Well, I think the answer to this question has to do with maybe A, not really being aware that a person was created in the first place that's anything different than the you that was born. That's probably the first part. And then not being aware combined with not really having a reason to ever question it, because it would appear to me that the last 100 years, although some things have happened, they may not have been as extreme as events of the past that may have caused humanity to step back and say, you know, well, wait a minute, there's something really isn't right here, and you just can't avoid the sense that's taking place that you know, you may be in danger, something to do with survival and freedoms, a real, what appears to be a real world event that would cause an individual to question it. So on that note, if you've never heard of it, maybe now you're just being brought to it because of a reason to pay attention to it. And on that note, if you have a reason to pay attention to this and you've been introduced to it as hogwash or nonsense, I would strongly encourage you not to worry about whether or not you have heard about this from anyone else, and simply decide to choose for yourself. Think for yourself what this information means to you and whether or not it resonates to the core of your being. Next question. Does an individual have to disown the person or the corporation in order to claim or reclaim historic authority, rights, and freedoms? So once again, I would say no. The person is there if or when you choose to use it. And many would likely agree that at this point, it would likely be very difficult to not use the person at all for anything if you want to be where other people are. So if you live in the forest and you're completely away from everyone and everything, at that point you're technically back to historic survival. So the person would not be useful to you. So think of the person as, you know, should you decide to claim this authority through filing notices, as background protection. And I'm not saying that the person is something that is a hardship for a natural being or an individual, because there really has to be some sort of accountability tracking system. So the idea of a person or a tracking system isn't something that I should clarify that I would describe as a burden on someone. But more so the integrity of the collective authority platform that's responsible for it. That is really the main concern at the root of this video series, is to make sure that collective authority doesn't take advantage of their authority and of the people and their rights and freedoms. Next question. What are some examples of when to decide to be a team player by agreeing to administrate for the person or the corporation? Well, first of all, from the perspective of myself and this video series, if you haven't figured it out by now, I am never in the capacity of my person. And I have not been in the capacity of my person since 2013, when I quit the last job that I was working under a social insurance number, which is part of the collective agreement bargaining platform. Once I figured out that the social insurance number was significant, I no longer had any reason to be in the capacity of my person. And I recognize that's different than most of the viewers who weren't aware the birth certificate was created and who likely just believe that that's who you are and that's who you believe, what you believe your entire life, and if you're comfortable doing so. But the purpose of this series is to challenge you to think about it more, because there really is only 3 considerations that I have found from my experience as a sovereign to consider being a team player and agreeing to produce your person. And only one of those considerations is actually something that would prove that you're in the capacity of the person. Now, remembering, proving that you are the person is very important. For someone to be able to prove it, they have to prove that you are in the capacity of it. So I put together this example, 3 examples of the person or the corporation and when to choose to be a team player. So the first 2, I'm going to say, does not prove that you're in the capacity of your person or the corporation, but it is required to produce the person for a valid safety concern related to being on public land. So the first one is passports. I've been mentioned to the passport already, and the idea for the passport is if you're leaving one secured place of authority and entering to another secured place of authority, it's important that we make sure as people come and go that they're don't have a tendency to commit crimes. And if they do, and that we know that we want to have some awareness of it or perhaps prevent it, rightfully so, as a valid safety concern. The second consideration as to what I would describe as being a team player to choose to provide your person would be as a driver. And this is similar to the safety concern as passing ports, because you're on public land and you're crossing paths with other humans. So there is a safety concern. You're also in a vehicle or some sort of portal that can cause harm to others in the process of traveling on that public land, so there's a liability concern. So I did travel 4 years without a driver's license, and at that point I was still figuring out the process, which I'm going to talk about. It cost me $30,000 to learn some of the information I'm going to share with you that will hopefully save you a lot of money, and the only reason it cost me money to learn the lesson of the difference between traveling as a free human being and driving is because I didn't recognize the process yet, and I didn't know how to use the process efficiently, which I now do feel I know and have established myself with sovereign authority being recognized and defended, and I'm happy to share it with you. So it really boils down to, and I'll have to make a separate video to explain it in more detail, as far as being a driver, why should you agree to be a team player and administrate and have the person's driver's license active if you're going to drive on public land where there's other people, again, if you're out in the forest, it doesn't matter and there's no one around, because no one's ever going to make a claim against you. But if there's other people around, the liability. Worst case scenario, a real accident happens, somebody dies, and you don't have liability insurance because you decided you were going to be free on the road. It's not fair on a collective common land, because how does the family deal with that? And how do you... So there has to be a liability consideration, and that's what it boils down to. Can you travel freely? Yes. You will get away with it easiest if there's nobody around, is what it boils down to. Now the third one is what I'm going to describe as, it does prove that you're in the capacity of the person or the corporation, but it's not required because there's no valid safety concern. So it's kind of funny how these things go. These are the only three ways that I can imagine that a person would be required, and I will make note to utilities and services. I will actually show a little picture here really quick as part of this. You'll see that the utility bills are noted as sovereign. And again, I'll make another video what that's all about, but even utilities and services, you never really have to be in the capacity of your person. You can always administrate. The only time it can be proven that you're in the capacity of your person, because you didn't sign your birth certificate, and even if you signed a social insurance number, you don't really have to use it, is the point, because there's no safety concern that could be brought against you should you decide to do something for yourself under your being capacity that has nothing to do with the collective authority and income taxes and all of that. That's your decision. The only concern would be if you're fraudulent in your contracts. So again, integrity comes into play if you're going to choose to do something for yourself, which I'll talk about in a minute as far as the difference between operating as a business or a responsible being, accountable being. So it really boils down to no concern, but the reason they can, no safety concern, but the reason they can prove, or it can be proved that you were in the capacity of your person during this time is you actually signed an agreement. Every time you sign up under social insurance number, you're signing documents that are each time refreshing your agreement to follow the collective's guidelines, including paying taxes. It's a bigger corporation that you're essentially part of, and you're agreeing to be part of that corporation as compared to being your own being and what's called engaging in commerce. So moving on with that question being, what is the difference between operating as a registered business versus operating as an accountable free being, also known as engaging in commerce? Let's dive into this one. Now, to answer this question, I'm going to refer to some notes here just so I could keep my thoughts organized in the process. So I just want to start off by saying that I have operated as an accountable free being since 2013. I recently just mentioned the 2013 being the last time that I worked under a social insurance number. I recall that moment clearly. Shortly after that moment in 2013, I filed my notices to state claim to the appropriate authorities. One of those authorities was Revenue Canada. I also cancelled the business registration as well as the GST number with the explanation no longer operating as a business. So operated from 2013 until the current time of the posting of this video as an accountable free being. And in 2020, similar to most small businesses, I encountered a little bit of a roadblock as two of the three engagements in commerce that I take place in, that I provide services for, have literally come to a halt. And many folks are in the same position. I, for one, as I define sovereignty, will not take any government grants or assistance. So that's something that's not available to me. But in the process, I guess the main point is, you might say, if I decide to do something like that and operate, as my own being, how then would I be able to process payments? And am I going to experience some challenges along the way from, businesses and corporations? I will tell you really quick that I have contracted. They're called contract for hire agreements. They're not invoices. I have contracted with hundreds of corporations, including a few law firms. So the folks that are in the business, literally, of watching out for things like this, school divisions and districts, as well as other persons, I have had a couple of challenges, but zero concerns that ended up, surfacing. So one of them I can tell you really quick. So I provided entertainment services, also a keynote speaker for schools for about 15 years before 2020, and one certain division I presented to a couple of their schools. It's a full school assemblies about knowledge, believe it or not. And the division, the school said go to the division, they'll produce payment for you. I arrived and they asked me to fill out a sheet with the social insurance number. Obviously I refused and explained it to them, so they refused payment. I had suggested that they contact Revenue Canada and do some more research and inquire. Less than 24 hours payment was produced, and all I was asked to do was fill out a piece of paper, which I filled out as the sovereign being, which is basically a notice, because at this point I knew how to do notices and I knew that they were effective. I had already seen the benefits of using my voice with integrity and learning the progress and the process. So payment was produced. I will also say, as far as friction from another corporation, I was providing service for a corporation. They intended to cancel the service, but they didn't inform us. So we showed up to provide the service, and at that point they kind of just dismissed it and said, too bad, we don't want to. And maybe at that point they had got the sense that I was operating as a sovereign, and in the eyes of folks who really don't understand it, they immediately assume, oh, they'd never get away with this, let's just throw them to the curbside because they're breaking the law. So I actually used my sovereign voice and wrote notices, and my integrity was so strong. As soon as I filed a small claims consideration with the Justice Department, and I kind of had a sense this would happen, that it would never see a courtroom, and the Justice Department would assist, and they certainly did. I'll have to make another video to show you how my sovereign integrity was recognized and defended by the collective authority. In another video I'll have to show it to you, but I will say within days of filing that, payment was received in full. So does it work? I would say yes. It has been my experience that as long as you have integrity and you know how to defend your authority and not be fraudulent in your contracts, because of course integrity really starts to come into play when you're accountable for yourself, it works very well. I would also like to say that perhaps I've paid it forward enough that karma was gracious enough to allow me to be in the position to pay off mortgage on this land and this property that I call home as of April 1st, 2020. Many viewers would recognize the significance of the timing of that. In the process, there have been no concerns from Revenue Canada. Not one word. Other than the conversation of the phone call that I made shortly after serving the notice in 2013. I contacted the Non-Compliance Division of Revenue Canada. The first 20 minutes of the conversation or so was judgmental and a little bit hard, and I was still sort of new at the process. By the end of the conversation, the senior agent made this statement to me. He said, Andre, or whatever you want to call yourself, it boils down to this. So long as legal income is reported, you will be treated like everyone else. Listen carefully. You do have the choice to operate under your social insurance number as a business, with your person, your corporation, or as your own accountable natural being. Next question. What is the difference between authority on private land versus public land? Two questions related to answering that would be, where are you least likely to be challenged, and where are you most likely to be challenged? And by challenged, I mean your authority is challenged. So it's a claim, either a crime or a concern that's brought forward, or a trespass, a notice related to private land. So there's really only 4 what I'm calling routes to crimes from private land versus public land. Those 4 are, number 1, to harm another person or being, depending on what capacity they're considering themselves in. Number 2, to harm others' verifiable property, which would mean to steal or to damage, something along those lines. Number 3 would be fraud, to be negligent or misleading in your contracts. So we talked about this, about the businesses, whether you're operating as a business or an accountable individual being. It's really important that integrity comes into play and you honor your contracts with integrity. Number 4 is trespass, others' rights or property. So basically, these are the things that could happen that would put you in a position of being challenged or questioned, your authority. So it boils down to this, to keep it simple for this video. Where are you least likely to be challenged? On private land. So whether you're the owner of this land or whether you're a renter or you are authorized to be there, these are places where an individual needs a place to go to have solitude. So at that place, you have the most authority because it's where your individual solitude authority resides. And where are you most likely to run into these situations? Well, on public land. So on public land, you're most likely to be challenged, and at that point, I'm just describing this as you have the least authority. Your authority is still valid, except the considerations are much, much greater because you could technically trespass others or harm others or their property. So there's so many considerations when you go out to public land where the collective has a reason to pay attention to you, question you, where there's just less reason to do that at home. So as I expand on this, the next question is, what would I do or say if challenged by officers or officials claiming authority over me on public land? An example would be attending a peaceful protest. So now you're on collective authority. This is land that everybody can go and share. And if you would have seen in the last video, from video number 5, we talked about an example of what to say in order to follow a peaceful protest and process so that you don't get arrested. So you're on collective land and you're being challenged. It's pretty much the same format, except you're not driving in a vehicle, so there's no safety concern and liability concern related to the vehicle, so even less of a reason to be questioned from a sovereign perspective if you have not committed a crime and you're questioning why you're being questioned in the first place. So the first question from the officer or the official would just be a little bit different. They're going to always want your person. They're immediately trying to contract with your corporation. What's your name? What's your birth date? And that's why they're always trying to get ID, because that's the first thing they need to be able to take authority over you. And if you don't know that your being and your individual authority has that much power, and by saying, I'm not in the capacity of my person, why are you, asking them to clarify? I'm not going to go through it again. You have to watch video number 5 and you'll get the sense that this is the process that can be followed if you don't want to get arrested. So pretty much the same process if you're confronted on public land. The next question is, what would I do and say if challenged by officers or officials claiming authority over me on private land? An example might be, someone called and said, right? So this is now individual authority. Now, if they're not acting upon a warrant, technically you can refuse contract or contact. Meaning, let's just be realistic. If a collective authority or any type of authority is showing up at your door with a warrant, they are likely acting on some pretty confident sources of proof already and an urgent situation that requires urgent action that they would describe as surpassing your authority. So whether or not you're on private land or public land, if there's a reason to act, a sensitive reason, basically if they're acting on a warrant, you could choose to fight your authority if you want, but we all know it never goes good. So why not just take a peaceful approach, because we also know that they're not just going to go away if they have a warrant. If they don't have a warrant, that's where we start to talk about how your individual authority is refreshed, because at that point there doesn't seem to be any sensitive nature for the reason for contract. If there was, they would have a warrant already. So when you're in your place of solitude, and especially if you know you haven't committed a crime, you are essentially able to refuse contact and use the very similar communication. If you even decide to communicate at all, I would say the best approach, if possible, if you know you haven't committed a crime and there's something really questionable going on, is just to avoid contact altogether. Don't even bother saying hello, and especially you notice, opening the door is the first beginning of a contract in their eyes, right? Because the collective authority, if they're showing up, let's just say they believe there's a reason of safety, so they have an obligation for others to, even if it's just someone who called, in their mind they have an obligation to research the safety concern. Now, if they can't communicate with you, well, I guess they can't communicate with you. If they have a warrant, they're going to make sure they satisfy their purpose at the time. Either way, if at the end of the day the peaceful process is the best way to go, and as we continue to teach you this peaceful process, pay close attention. Now, assuming they don't have a warrant and someone showed up at your property, keep in perspective what's happening here. Your individual authority has the most authority on private land, and the collective authority is basically asking to contract with you. If they don't have a warrant and forcing you to forcing their authority upon you for what I would say is likely a good reason, they're basically asking for a handshake for you to, hey, you want to come over and negotiate this matter here? And as soon as they get that, yes, my name is, yes, my birth date is, in their eyes, technically, you don't know this. And even if you did, you haven't spoken up. So you're probably guilty, or you don't really care about your freedom. So in their eyes, that could be a perspective. So remember, this is your individual authority, and they're asking you to join them here on the corporate collective platform bargaining table, essentially a contract, which might include something to do with money eventually for some reason. So I have this sign up at the end of my driveway. It's really simple, no trespassing notice, and by putting the notice up in advance, it's sort of like being proactive, right? There shouldn't be a question. Here's a photo of the actual notice posted at both municipal entrances to the property. So this is a really proactive way to maybe even avoid them getting to the doorstep, maybe even to avoid them trying to confront you on your land. I have seen recently, if a collective authority really wants to try to bargain with you on the corporation side with your person, and you have notices up, as soon as you leave your property, especially if you're in a motor vehicle, there's reasons that they might find to then take authority over questioning your person. So at that point, they may try to serve you, but at the end of the day, it's the exact same process. Protest and duress. Why are you doing this? Please clarify. If I provide my person, I need you to note it's protest and duress. Thank you. Have a nice day. And follow it up with notices, which we're going to talk about a little bit more as we move forward. Next question. Why is it not recommended to wait for the court date to defend yourself and say what you have to say? Well, first of all, before 2013, I was the type of individual that would go to court. If I received a summons for pretty much any reason, I would go to court as an opportunity to defend myself. I didn't see it as an opportunity at that time, perhaps a little bit of a hindrance, and I always had this question since as far back as I could think for myself, what is it that gives another authority over me? So I was really just acting on this question that's been a part of me since I was a child. So I started filing notices. Well, before 2013, I had difficulty having my voice heard. I was still quite peaceful for the most part, but I was a little angry in the beginning, trying to figure this out, which a lot of folks might go through a phase of anger, which I would recommend you try to whip through that as fast as possible and get back to integrity and be calm and actually learn, because it is a process, and that's the point. When I started filing notices in 2013, I noticed the difference. It was working. I was being a little bit more assertive, talking from my sovereign voice, and it was being acknowledged, but not fully. There was still a little bit of immaturity on my part, and it wasn't balanced. And over time, the way I describe this is, it wasn't until I respected the process that the process respected me, including speaking from a sovereign voice. So essentially what was learned, by waiting for a court date, it's almost like saying to the justice system that either you don't really care enough to speak up for yourself, or you've already agreed that it's okay with you to negotiate this on their terms, under their agreements, under their collective authority, using your person, which does take away some of your authority. By not saying anything, it shows them that either you don't care, or maybe you are guilty, or maybe, well, if somebody really did care, they might say something. So if you don't, at the end of the day, the justice system can look at it as, you know, because they expect you to try to talk and negotiate and maybe even come up with a solution without even having to use court time or resources at all. And if you put yourself in the shoes of a judge, you might start to see eventually that if all they see day in and day out is people, person or being, showing up and not really putting much effort in, especially if they're a little bit angry or frustrated with the process, which I'll speak to in a moment, the importance of peace is essential. But essentially, if you're in the justice system and all you see is those that are basically coming to you, asking for you, I know it might sound like a little bit of a derogatory term, but to babysit them, to make decisions for them, to be the final answer, when really if you want to negotiate your authority and talk about your authority and stand strong in your authority, you probably would say something. So it just doesn't reflect well if you wait for a court date and hope for the best. So essentially, waiting for the court date could be perceived as ignorance and incompetence, which is not really a light that you want to walk into a courtroom with. So use the process. Speak about things in advance, which I'm going to talk more about. Moving forward, next question. What is the importance of a peaceful and clear communication between you, or your knowledgeable representative, and the accuser, or the one who's claiming authority? Now, this is the collective authority. Now, as we start to dive into this, I need to note, first of all, you're the one that has a choice on how to defend your authority. So you can either hire a lawyer. Now, this is coming from a sovereign perspective. To find a lawyer that knows about sovereignty is going to be difficult. I think some of them are starting to tune in, which will be helpful for the future. Or you. So what I'm saying is, should you ever have to go to a courtroom, whether the lawyer's the one talking for you in advance or you are communicating in advance, that's the first approach. But should you ever have to end up in a courtroom and explain your authority and where you're coming from and defend it, to have it recognized, you either need to find a lawyer that knows what you're talking about, that you can really trust to defend you, so someone outside of you, or getting back to, there is no easy answers, because the courts quite often will give someone who's not a lawyer, part of their collective, who we won't talk about, I don't know the guidelines there, but if you're not part of the bar, immediately it doesn't seem to reflect very well. So you might have trouble getting someone who's not a lawyer to defend you, who does understand sovereignty. So at the end of the day, if you catch what I'm saying, it boils down to you taking the time to just love yourself enough to have integrity and protect your authority. Be aware of what you're doing and saying, because then you can be confident. And when your integrity is in check and you know that something's not right, all you have to do is speak up for yourself. Even if you're using common language, you don't have to teach yourself to be a lawyer here. A standard understanding would help you to assert yourself with dignity in the court system and respect the process, which, if you're paying attention, I'll help you to learn. Another thing here is there's kind of a benefit to this process that the Justice Department has created, because the accuser has the burden of proof. So as you're communicating, you're really just asking the accuser to provide proof or explain to you what it is they're trying to claim authority over and why they're trying to claim authority and prove that they have authority over you. So if you do that peacefully and clearly, they have the burden to respond. Now, if they, through the process, this is really important. If you do try to do something, what's happening during the clear and peaceful communication? Well, it's telling the justice system something, you know, who really wants it? And there is a reason for appeals in Supreme Courts. I can say that when I go to, you know, the first level of court, it's often quite typical. I would say, you know, let's move along with things, and most people don't really know what their authority is, and it's a process that usually moves pretty fast unless someone decides to try to bring forward a good case. So are they trying? And then the result necessarily doesn't go the way you want, but maybe the individual's like, hey, I don't really agree with that. I guess I'll just pay the bill, or I'll pay the summons because nothing else I can do now anyways. But there is a reason for appeals in Supreme Courts, and I've noticed when I've taken things to appeal or to a Supreme Court situation that the level of integrity from the officials there is obviously different. Yes, there can be corruption at any level of the Justice Department. As I've said before, for every individual who might be corrupted, I like to believe there's that many or more that are not. And there also is an increased level of accountability at higher levels of court, because obviously someone wants to speak up more, so they're gonna assert their voice more. And if they're doing it peaceful and they're not in conflict, they have an obligation to listen, and it tells them something when you take the time to just speak up for yourself. So there is a reason for the appeals in Supreme Courts. It shows that it distinguishes you from all those who maybe don't care, or for any reason they're just not putting as much effort in. And if you are, there must be a reason, so that makes them want to hear you more. And if you say what you have to say peacefully, they're more likely to listen to you, and if they agree with you, depending on how well you did it, then you're more likely to have your authority recognized, including being defended, because you have proven your integrity. You've proven that you're worthy, and you can handle the responsibility of taking care of yourself. And that's what they need to see. With billions of people around the world, it's hard to determine that. And they can't just assume everyone can, because in their eyes, lots of people are asking for things, and lots of people are asking for the government to take care of them. So they're trying to just do their best to manage the collective authority, and any type of abuse, well, that's where we come in, to start speaking up for ourselves and communicating peacefully. And that is important. You see the different colors here in peaceful? That represents a balance between what's trying to happen, the authority, the process, the system, the rights and freedoms shield. Peaceful is the way to do it. Violence is not. And I like to use this example. If I'm a judge and I see an individual walk into the courtroom with so much as a wrinkle between their eyes, you know, you can read facial expressions, that's what's telling the collective authority whether or not there's an extra consideration here. Because if there's a tendency for violence or frustration or anger, it's not as balanced of a vibration, right? And if any time at any point the world appears to be trying to get you to be violent, especially political representatives, you must see it for what it is. Obviously, those political representatives have no idea what integrity is all about, because violence is not the way to accomplish progress. Do not fight with each other. Use the peaceful process. It's right there in front of you. And that's the way to get your authority recognized and defended. If you choose violence, where do you think you're going to end up? And next question. I agree with this as a being, but I'm not very good at speaking for myself, especially under pressure. Is there a way I could use this video series to assist me toward having this claim recognized and defended? I need to express once more, first of all, that it is really essentially important that you take the time to learn this information for yourself. As I've introduced already, there may and likely would come a time where you would need to explain this and show that it is something that makes sense to you at the core of your being. So should this particular video series make sense for you, and you realize that it really does make sense at the core of your being, or other type of information related to this, related to your rights and freedoms and survival that you can't deny is part of your truth, you can use this. So you don't have to learn to be a lawyer, but when information or data is presented, you can use it to build your case and to build your peaceful debate or as part of the process. So what could you do? You could download the videos and put them on some sort of storage device, and that way also it would protect the information into the future. Any type of information, especially if there's ever a concern of information being taken away for any reason at all, you may want to consider starting to download some valuable things so that you can still share them should anything like that happen. And related to this, you could do the same. As you're using information to help defend you, you could technically include it as part of your process so that there's more information for the collective to consider with your notices. I wouldn't recommend sending this with the notices right off the bat. I would recommend learning it. We can send notices right away and continue learning more on how to defend it as you've sent your notice, but I would say collect the information that works for you and your truths and learn it. Learn it to the core of your being, because if you agree that survival and freedoms are worth the effort, I think that speaks for itself. Next question. What if I like the idea of serving notices, but I'm concerned it could cause more conflict rather than the intended process or solution? Maybe if you try to look at this as a playground, and we're all back at preschool time, and there is something that you want to say to another. Usually you would just walk up and say it, and hopefully, you know, if it's peaceful, it's going great. If you know, you're not in that best of a mood, it doesn't go so great and it's not received so well. So on that note, filing notices at an adult level, even regarding a contract level, regarding your person or your being and talking with the big authorities, it really doesn't have to be perceived as much more as communicating in the playground. Communicate peacefully, and that's what Without Prejudice is all about. As I mentioned earlier in this video series, Without Prejudice ends up on all of my notices, and it's a background protection to your background protection, so to speak, because Without Prejudice basically means, as I've mentioned, you are agreeing to enter into a peaceful process. And you're agreeing that this is a learning process. You're also agreeing that you're open to considering the claim of authority, but through the process you're asking for clarification and proof. And because you're doing that peacefully and stating that by noting Without Prejudice, the effort, the correspondence, the notices cannot be used against you to state that you are in conflict, especially if you're doing it peacefully. So once again, a note that violence really has no place in social progress. Next question. How can I go about filing these notices? Well, you've probably noticed that we have one more section on the agenda to complete this video series, that being solutions for individual and government sovereignty moving into the future. So, because we've reached the point that I would describe as enough information for one video, I will tell you that in the next video, which will be the last video in this series, we will be presenting a Notice of Understanding and Claim of Right, is the title, and it will be for your review and consideration toward implementation. At any point that you should decide that you would like to move forward with claiming your historic rights and freedoms and starting the process of what I'm describing as background protection, I would recommend that you review the notice when it becomes available, and we're also going to be launching a very exciting initiative. And the initiative is going to be called National File Your Notice Day, and we're considering that for Valentine's Day. Love yourself enough to speak up for yourself and reclaim your historic rights and freedoms. And the last question, how do I know I'm sending notices to the right places? Well, once you have the opportunity to review the notice that's put forward, you will likely be able to see that this notice can be used universally and with some adjustments, and it is recommended that you always sort of make your notices unique to you, so adjust them if and when necessary so that it is true to you and you'll be able to explain it to your most accurate truths. Now, that notice will be universal, and how do you know who to send it to? Well, I will be elaborating on that as part of the last video, but a little bit of a fun exercise that might help you to think for yourself, which is important because this will help you to defend yourself and know how to be one step ahead. So the fun little challenge is, get yourself a piece of paper and a pen, just for old school's sake. Don't even use your phone. Let's go back to, how important it is to write, and maybe bring your kids on in with this and refresh the importance of keeping that skill. And try to think to yourself, who is it that has ever made a claim over me, and who is making a claim over me right now related to my person? And then see, when we match it up with the ideas and suggestions of common places to send your notices that will show up in the next video, see how many of those match up with those on your list. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you for the last video.